Everybody. I'm Emma Wildwood and I teach here in the School of Divinity. I'm delighted to be hosting a session with Mara Menzies, the Kenyan Scottish storyteller and writer, novelist. I have a few remarks to make before I introduce Mara and hand you over to her. So thank you very much for wearing your face masks unless you're exempt. Please do keep them on. And thanks again for keeping a little bit of distance. If the fire alarm goes, it's not a rehearsal. So please leave the building by the various fire exits. There's lots of them. I'm really delighted to meet Mara properly for the first time. She's going to say a little bit about her novel, Blood and Gold, which originated from the stage show of the same name. And it's a novel that explores the legacy of colonialism and slavery through myth, legend, and fantasy. She's also going to start by performing stories for us. Now, I had the pleasure of attending one of Mara's performances in the summer. Now, if you think the weather is bad today, the weather was even worse in August, and the audience was standing in a field in the pouring rain. So at least we haven't done that to you. Yet under our raincoats, we were all completely spellbound. Mara's storytelling transported us to new places of the imagination that both challenged and inspired. So it is a real pleasure to welcome her here this morning, to perform her work and to answer our questions about what inspired those stories. And I'm not going to give any further introduction. I'm going to hand straight over to you, Mara. Thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, thank you. So the first thing I'm going to do before I perform is I'm going to take off my shoes because I cannot perform in shoes. I don't know, some storytellers are the same, others are fine with it. But I like to feel a bit grounded, a bit rooted to the earth. So, thanks, Emma. I was wondering which stories to perform, and I think a lot of the time you go to authors' events and they will read from the book, and I thought, no, I'm going to do it differently because then that way you all have to read the book. So that's my cunning plan. But the stories that I am going to tell are from the book, or one of them is from the book, and I'm going to start off with a story that is not in the book, but it inspired one of the stories that are in the book. And the reason that I'm telling this story is because as a storyteller, I'm fascinated in how stories work. And I'm fascinated in how stories can reach people in different ways. And I often take different stories from my personal history, from folklore, from mythology, from different experiences, things that I see every day. And I take these stories and these experiences and I craft them and I mold them in different ways to suit particular purposes. So I'm going to start off with a story that I heard in Cuba. And I was at a festival there. One of the perks of storytelling is that you get to go to these amazing places and meet amazing people. And it was a storyteller who told me this story, and it is an Orisha story. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the Orisha are deities who originate from the Ifa faith system, from the Yoruba people of Nigeria, Western Nigeria. And during the slave trade, these stories carried across the oceans. But because the people were not allowed to practice their faiths, they hid the Orisha behind the Catholic saints. So when they were praying to Yemaya, who is the mother of the fish, they would, in reality, they were actually, when they were praying to the Virgin Mary, they were actually praying to Yemaya. And so they hid these Orishas behind different saints, Catholic saints. And so now you have the syncretic faiths that popped up, like Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé, Lukumi, different kinds of faiths. So this is one of the Orisha stories, and it's the story of a hunter. And his name was Ochosi. What was his name? Ochosi. Sorry, what was his name? Ochosi. And Ochosi, they say, was the finest hunter that ever lived. He lived in the middle of a forest and he respected and loved everything about his surroundings. In the mornings, He would gather up his traps and his snares, he would take them out, and he knew that when he returned, he would find his intended prey captured within. Whenever he released the arrow from its bow, he knew that it would hit its mark. And the forest respected him in return. But Ochosi was a man with a dream, and the thing that he wanted more than anything else in the world was to become one of the Orisha. So he would fling himself to the ground, he would raise his arms to the sky, and he would pray to Olodumare, please, let me join Yameya, let me join Elegba in your service, send me a sign, please. But no sign ever came. So Ochosi he had to do the things that needed to be done. He would hunt, he would pray, and sometimes he would visit his mother who lived on the other side of the forest. But one day, he was feeling a little bit peckish. So he took up his bow and arrow, went out into the forest, and he saw a young antelope through the trees. And a few hours later, there was that antelope roasting on a spit in front of his house. Now, apologies to the vegetarians in this room, but the smell of this roast meat was divine. It was beautiful. Oh, the aroma wafted through the trees. And it just so happened that one of the Orisha was walking through the forest. It was Elegba, the Orisha of the Crossroads. Oh, and this Elegba is one of the Orisha who likes the naughty things in life. Too much fine food, too much wine, too much dancing, too many women, too much everything. And this smell filled his nostrils. He followed his nose and he found himself at Ochosi's house. And Ochosi could not believe his eyes. Welcome, please sit. Let me wash your hands. Let me wash your feet. Everything, anything you want, I will give to you. And they sat and they talked and they shared story after story. And Elegba told Ochosi of a party that was taking place in Orun, the home of the gods, in 3 days' time. And Ochosi listened, but he knew that as a mere man, he could never attend, so he contented himself with dreaming. But when the meal had ended, Elegba turned to Ochosi and said, I wonder if you can help me. When I go to this party, I want to take a gift for the great creator Olodumare, but I don't know what to take. I want something exquisite, magnificent, something that has never been gifted before, but I'm out of ideas. And Ochosi knew that this was his moment. If he could please the Orisha, then anything could happen. And so he thought and he had it. In the forest, there was a bird. And this bird had the most beautiful feathers. It sparkled and shimmered with blues and pinks, purples, oranges, yellows. It was an incredibly beautiful bird. So beautiful that he had never tried to capture it before. But this bird was worthy of the great creator. Elegba liked the sound of this, so he agreed. And so off he went, promising to return in 3 days' time. And the bird had to be ready. And Ochosi that night, he lay on his bed and he dreamt sweet dreams of the impending glory. And first thing in the morning, he gathered up his traps, he went out into the forest, he laid them down, he returned back to his home. He relaxed. And after a few hours, he returned, filled with confidence, back down to the traps. He looked at them and they were empty. Empty. Every single one was empty, and this had never happened before. For the first time in his life, he was filled with doubt and panic. But he gathered his traps up, and he went to a new part of the forest, and he placed the traps down. And this time, when he returned home, he was pacing up and down anxiously. And when he returned a few hours later, he looked at the traps, and again, empty, 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 every single one. Now, he was in full panic mode. If he failed to find this bird, who would respect him? He could imagine the Orisha. Look, there is Ochosi. The hunter, the one who could not hunt. He imagined the shame and he thought, no, I have to find this bird. And so he gathered up his traps and he went to the furthest reaches of the forest. He placed the traps down and he prayed, please, this is when I need you more than ever. I need that bird. He returned home and he waited. And after a few hours, he went back out into the forest, empty, empty. But in the last trap, there was something moving, something shimmering and sparkling and glittering. And when he took out the bird, it was beyond his wildest dreams. It was spectacular. He could see everything shimmering and shining out of this bird, and it opened its little beak. Oh, what a sound! He took the bird and held it close to his chest. And he returned back to his home, and there was a little cage on a shelf, so he placed the bird in the cage and closed the door. He started to look around for some grain because this bird had to be in perfect condition, worthy of the great creator. But as he looked around, he saw that there was no grain in his home. So he decided to leave and get some. But when he left, a few moments later, there was a knock on the door. Ochosi! It was his mother. She had come to pay her son a visit. And when there was no answer, she let herself in. She looked around. She commented on the mess and the chaos. Children leave things here, left, right, center. She sat herself down in her chair and she waited for her son. And she waited and she waited. She grumbled and moaned, my son, he's never here. Whenever I come, he's always too busy for his mother, always too busy. But as she looked around and she saw all the trophies of the hunt, she was filled with motherly pride. Oh, my son, the finest hunter in the world. Oh, he's such a good boy. I'm so proud, and I want my son to be happy. When he comes home, I want his heart to be filled with joy. And of course, the easiest way to do that, I'm sure you know, through the belly. She began to think, a nice feast for my hungry boy. Oh, the light of my life, something that will really fill his belly and make him laugh with happiness. And she began to think of all the wonderful meals that she could create. Tell me, what would you serve to the person you love most in the world?
Waji.
Huh?
Waji.
Waji, which is what?
It's rice and beans with spicy stew.
Oh, rice with beans and spicy stew. She thought, yes, let me serve him some waji. But on top of the waji, I also want to make some tablet brownies, because tablet brownies are so sweet, they explode in my mouth. It's delicious, wonderful. But not only that, because my son, the thing he loves more than anything is bird. Just then she heard a sound. And she looked up and, you're right, a bird. But not any bird. This bird was such a beautiful bird. And a bird this beautiful must have very tasty meat. So she began to pluck the feathers from the neck. And she's in a hunter's house, so all the knives are sharp. And she picked one and pop! She sliced off the head. She began to prepare a delicious meal, tidying away the feathers. Pang, 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 pang. She placed the meat in a pot. She started to look for some seasoning to make a delicious meal for her boy. There was no seasoning. And she couldn't understand how. How can he live in a house with no salt, no pepper, no seasoning? Can you live in a house like that? No, of course not. And so she decided that she would go back to her home, fetch the perfect seasoning, and then return. And so off she went. And as soon as she had gone, Ochosi returned, and immediately he saw the cage was empty, the bird was gone. No, somebody has stolen my bird. What am I going to do? And he gathered his thoughts and he said, no, Elegba will be here in a few hours. I can help this. I can fix this. He gathered his traps and he raced back out to the furthest reaches of the forest. He placed the traps down. He hid behind a tree. Please, please, I need a miracle, I beg you. A miracle he received because the mate of the first bird flew through the trees and landed on his shoulder. It was just as beautiful as the first, and its voice was just as sweet, and he took it home. He placed it in the cage. He fed it the grain, and he did not take his eyes off it. And in the morning, Elegba arrived, and when he saw this bird, he couldn't believe it. It was beyond his imagination. He thought, this bird is perfect. Ochosi, I cannot take credit for this alone. You are coming to Orun with me. Yes, 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 yes. Oh, he oiled his skin until he shone like the stars. He wore his finest robes. He combed out his hair. He looked magnificent. And when he was ready, the two of them climbed the ladder of light that led to Orun. It was perfection. It was a dream. The aromas and fragrances, the colors, everything, the music filled his ears. It was beyond his expectation. And then the giving of the gifts began. And Olodumare, the creator, took each one with gratitude and then placed it to one side. And when he received the bird, he asked, "Who has given me this bird?" Elegba stepped forward and said, "The gift is from me, but it is this man Ochosi who helped me find it." And Ochosi was summoned before the creator. And I don't know any of your own individual religious, spiritual beliefs, but imagine that you are asked to face the creator of everything. He didn't know how to think, what to feel. He wondered, should he grovel on the ground or should he stand strong and proud and tall? He had no idea, but somehow he found his way before the creator. And as he stood there, Olodumare spoke to him. "I know who you are. And I am pleased with this gift that you have given to me. And because of this, and because of your love and respect for your home, I am going to honor your request. From this moment on, you will be known as Ochosi, the Orisha of the hunt." Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Joy filled his soul. He leapt up, light as air. You have never seen a happier man. He was spinning and whirling and pirouetting, embracing the other Orisha. They welcomed him into the fold. And after some time, Olodumare summoned him back and said, "Ochosi, now that you are one of us, I want to give you a gift. Anything your heart desires." But Ochosi didn't know. He puzzled over. He thought, what can I propose? What can I offer? I don't know. What can I ask for? Because the only thing that he had ever wanted was this. He had his dream. He had his greatest desire. And the more he thought about it, the more he thought about how much he had wanted it, how much he had craved it, longed for it, desired it with every fiber of his being, and he remembered how close he had come to having none of it at all. Somebody had stolen his bird, and by some miracle, if the other one had not flown through the skies and landed on his shoulder, he would still be Ochosi, the man in the middle of the forest, so he knew exactly what he wanted. He took out his bow and arrow, and he said, "When I release this arrow, I want it to pierce the heart of the person who stole my bird. But Olodumare knows everything. I ask that you reconsider your request." But by now, he was fired up. "No, it's the only thing I want. When I release this arrow, it must pierce the heart of the person who stole my bird." And Olodumare granted his request. And the arrow, it flew through the skies and the clouds and the trees and straight into the heart of his mother. And as she fell backwards, she clutched the arrow, and her cries carried up to Orun, and he recognized her voice. No, no, please. No, this is not what I want at all. I've changed my mind. I don't want any of it. Please take it back. I just want things to be as they are. Please, please, I am begging you. But Olodumare does not turn back time. And Ochosi fell to the ground, a broken heap of a man. And when the tears had run dry, Olodumare raised him up and said, Ochosi, you have learnt a painful lesson today. You have seen that you must never judge one action on one truth alone. You must look at all the truths surrounding any action. And because of this, you will not only be the Orisha of the hunt, you will also be the Orisha of justice. And so to this day, for many people who are caught in that place, perhaps we've all been there, where we genuinely don't know if something is right or wrong, they pray to the Orisha Ochosi for guidance in helping them make the right decision. So that is my first story for you. Thank you. And I used that story in a way, maybe we'll talk about it, maybe not, but yeah, just to kind of explore culture and stripping away of culture. So it's done in a different kind of way, but that is the story that inspired a story in the book. And this next story, I'm going to, 5 minutes, okay. Yeah, I'll keep it short. The next story that I'm going to tell is a story that was inspired by the story of Ahmed Sheikh, who was a Somali student who was murdered in a racist attack in the grass market in 1989, and nobody was ever brought to justice for his murder. And I'm going to tell the story very, very quickly. But it's a story of a man and his wife who had a beautiful child, and they lived in a far away land, a beautiful place, but there was a poison in this land. But as the child grew, they saw the starlight in his eyes, and they saw how curious he was, how smart he was, and they thought this child could be the one to help us rid the land of this poison. But to do that, he needed to leave. He needed skills and experience and knowledge, something he could never find in his own land. But there was a place, the land in the sky. Stories abounded of this place, but it was hard to get to, and it was far, and it was difficult. But they saved up all their gold, and as the child grew and grew and grew, when he was a young man, they gave him the gold and they sent him on his way. And he climbed over mountains, walked across sands, he swam across raging oceans until one day he saw a rope descending from the sky. He had arrived, and he grabbed that rope and he started to climb, but the land in the sky does not accept people too easily. And when they saw this young man climb, they sent wind and rain to knock him off that rope, but he clung on with his every strength, every ounce of energy that he possessed. And when the wind and the rain had eased, he continued to climb. They poured oil down that rope because the land in the sky does not accept people too easily, but he kept on. They sent hornets that stung his back, his shoulders, his neck. He cried out with pain, but he continued to climb. And just as he approached, they set fire to that rope. And then he produced the gold. And when they saw that sparkle and gleam, they hauled the young man up and they welcomed him in. And it was a beautiful place. And he had opportunities open up to him that he had never had before. And he seized them all. But one day the sun was shining, a beautiful day. And he went out with his friends, and across the room, he saw the most beautiful woman in the world. Her hair was the color of the sun, her smile was wide, and they started to talk. And they were so fixed on each other, so deeply engaged in conversation, they did not see a young man with a furrowed brow. And he was gazing at them, swirling a golden liquid. And as he peered into his glass, the shadow man emerged from the cobblestones, slithered across the tabletop into his drink, and he began to cast his spell. Look at them, all smiles and laughter. Look at him. You know what he's after. violent, aggressive, no sense of shame, always in trouble, always to blame. I tell you all the time, this beast, it wants to gorge, it wants to feast, it wants to take the good, the just, but you can stop it. Yes, you must. And emboldened by these words, the young man with the furrowed brow, he stood. He took weapons from the shadow man, and he approached the young man with the sparkling eyes, but in its place, there was no human. There was a monster, a beast with a head too big for its body. Its nostrils flared, its fists were clenched, ready to smash and crush and destroy. I'm going to stop there because I know we've run out of time. So you're going to have to continue the story elsewhere because we're about halfway through.
Now I'm sorry that we arranged a time because we could hear that. Maybe, if we have time, we could hear the ending at the end.
I could, yeah. They'll just have to remember where I'll have to remember where I left off.
We'll see how we go.
Yeah.
But Mara, that was superb, the way that you pulled us into stories in the first instance that have been powerful for people across the globe that have enabled people to carry their own heritage and their own faith with them across the Atlantic. So that's really, really powerful. I want to talk a little bit about your book now, because both those stories appear in the book. And I just want to hold it up so that you can all see it. These are available. Oh, sorry, it's on the screen, I was just being told. Copies are available in the Rainey Hall, and Mara will be able to sign some of them if you'd like a signed copy. This book is an absolute delight. But I notice that particularly your first story is told in a different way. It serves a little bit of a different function in the book. And I wondered if you could start by telling us how your stories have lives of their own, clearly, and how you use them in different ways.
Yeah, I think as a storyteller, all storytellers have their own way of crafting stories and are inspired by different things. And I certainly draw stories from my own personal background, from stories that have been passed down to me, stories that I am exposed to, stories that I hear from different kinds of storytellers. But I feel that all of these stories, they like you say, they do serve different functions. You know, it's when I'm creating a story, I might have my own intention or the reason that I craft a particular story in a certain way, but I also know that I have no idea who's going to receive that story. And I think everybody in this room, everybody in the world, we're all on different points in our journey. And so the same story is not going to hit in the same way. So I have to leave flexibility for that as well. And I think the first story is the one about, the mother and the dying mother. So I framed it in this way because essentially what happens is there's a mother who has a daughter and the mother is dying. But the mother recognizes the power of stories and needs to leave these stories for her daughter because stories, I guess, root you and ground you, and they inform you who you are and who you come from and where you come from. And the more rooted you are and the more certain or sure you are of yourself, then you're more of a tree rather than a blade of grass just kind of blowing in the wind. So she recognizes this. So as she is getting weaker, she puts all her stories into a box. And then this shadow man character, who is, in the second story, is this character that I created that also recognizes the power of stories and then tries to prevent the box from being opened. Of course, the box is opened, and the shadow man is everywhere because the shadow man actually in real life is everywhere. And I created that as I guess it could be interpreted in lots of different ways. It could be fear, it could be also, it's that voice that basically speaks to people in different ways. So I kind of put that at the center of all the stories as well, because, what I was trying to, I guess, get across in a lot of the stories is how we interact with the world and what are the things the barriers and the limitations that we put on ourselves. Why are those limitations there in the first place? looking at why people move around, so the first story is based on how my mother ended up moving from Kenya to Scotland, although in the book it's never mentioned, places are never mentioned. The other stories are kind of looking at the transatlantic slave trade and how this woman is taken from her world and placed into another world, and how she has to deal with whatever is going on in that place, and then her connection to her old world is severed in a sense, or it changes. So I look at stories and I find different ways that I can give them meaning in a different way, and I use a lot of symbolism. So like the rope that leads to the land in the sky, for me that was immigration. The land in the sky, the land of milk and honey. So I find different ways to incorporate different ideas into story, but not with a particular message. Just I tell a story and people will take it as they receive it.
Thank you. And for those of you who haven't yet read the book, as you've explained, the character called Jeddah, who loses her mother, and you were pointing out to me that you don't ever say Edinburgh in the book, and yet the book is delightfully illustrated by Eri Griffin with a number of pictures which are, if anyone knows Edinburgh, are clearly Edinburgh. So you can see, you get, in fact, New College features in one of her drawings, as she goes up Arthur's Seat, and these kind of things. So if you use the drawings as a guide, you get a particular sense of place. But anyone who doesn't know Edinburgh could just read it as a story. And you've already indicated that this is based on your own story and the stories particularly of your mother and what you know of her heritage. Tell us a little bit more about those experiences of your own that you're drawing readers to. So my intention was to look at colonialism and slavery from a different perspective, because I felt at the time that there was just one way of speaking about it, and it was quite a hard way, and it was very very black and white, very sort of this is right and this is wrong, and looking at the legacy of that, it's a really uncomfortable subject for people to deal with, because nobody wants to be on the side of an oppressor, and I felt that it was when you have those kinds of stories and narratives presented in such a way that often they can actually stop conversation from taking place, and I think over the last few years certainly I've experienced and noticed that people are afraid to say what they think, because the second you give a different opinion, even if it's from a place of I don't know very much and I want to know more, often you can be slammed right down. You should know more, and there's this expectation on us as human beings to all be at a certain elevated level, and I don't think that is a reality for everybody. So I wanted to take a softer approach. And I've totally forgotten your question. Well, I think you're answering it very well. So the experiences.
Yes.
Okay,
so I wanted to take a softer approach, and one of the things, the legacy of colonialism. I grew up in Kenya, which is a colonized country, and a lot of what was introduced during the colonial rule, it does still have negative impact on the indigenous population of Kenya. A lot of the laws, education, conservation, all of these things are not suitable for the indigenous population. But my mother told me a story about my own family history in the, about 7 or 8 years ago that totally changed how I saw myself, because I knew my grandmother, but I didn't know my grandfather. And she told me the story of how he was a messenger boy for the district commissioner, so the British colonial government at the time, and he came from a culture where the men and the boys were celebrated, and they would do this, that, and the next thing, and a girl is a girl like a cow is a cow, essentially. So really the opportunities for women were very limited, and he saw that the wife of the district commissioner was doing the research and writing the reports and handing over speeches, and so he thought, girls are able to learn. So when he married my grandmother, they had 3 daughters. My mother was the oldest, and he decided to send them to school. And it caused a huge rift in his family, because they didn't understand what he was doing, and it was breaking tradition. He was wasting money. He should be spending the money on his boys. So in the end, they poisoned him. And my grandmother, there's a tradition called wife inheritance, where if your brother dies, then you assume responsibility of everything, which includes the wife and the children. So you would inherit your your brother's wife. So she knew that this was her destiny and she wasn't having it. So my grandmother was a village girl, so her world was very, very small. This was all she knew. But she decided that she was going to run away. So she took her 3 daughters and she left. And she went 40 kilometers to a town called Amkura. But she had no money, no food, no connections, no nothing. So she put my mother in an orphanage, and it was run by Scottish nuns. So my mother grew up in a Scottish-run orphanage, and through that she was sponsored by a woman in Edinburgh to come and study nursing in the 60s. So that was how my mother ended up coming to Scotland. And she just told me this so matter of fact. I was like, oh my God. You know, my grandfather was an amazing feminist. You know, my grandmother was this badass. She was, you know, so courageous and so amazing. And if I had never known that story, then my relationship with that side of my family would be really quite stunted, quite limited. So I took that story and I kind of turned it into this exploration of, you know, people traveling in balloons and traveling around the world or traveling somewhere, and that kind of movement of people, because it's not that there's one way that we move around the world, and it's not that, you know, things are gifted and people are taken. You know, there's migration happens in so many different ways, and this was my own sort of personal kind of family history. So I decided to incorporate that, but tell it in a very different way.
And I think that really struck me is when you are telling these stories of difficulty, and that, you know, you're telling stories in which people are watching slave caravans crossing a landscape. They are negotiating with strangers, and in the story about the bird that you recast in the book, the bird is torn apart by these strangers who are taking over the land. But in all this, your characters are powerful people. They have humanity and they have agency. So there is no sense of a kind of victimhood, but rather that people are trying to negotiate a place in the world. And I'm fascinated by the way the character of Jeddah, who's watching these stories of her ancestors, begins to take her own place in a very different world. And there are a number of points where, you know, she is the on the sharp end of racist abuse and so forth, and you really set her in this sense of in between the culture of her father and the cultures of her mother. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
I think one of the ways in which I feel I've been very privileged is that I had the fortune of growing up in Kenya, and I've also had the fortune of growing up in Edinburgh, because I moved to Edinburgh when I was 13. And so I've never been offended by the question, you know, where do you come from? Because I do have somewhere else that I come from, and I can identify with that place very easily. But I also have friends who are equally Kenyan-Scottish mixed, and they had never been to Kenya before. And the perception of what Africa was like, they did not want to come from Africa, because you don't want to come from a place that is diseased and war-torn and impoverished. You know, why would you want to associate yourself with that? So you distance yourself from it. But then it was also the expectation that you are able to speak for everybody. So you know, there's a bit in the book where she's in school and the teacher is very well-meaning, you know, and is asking her questions. You know, Jeddah will know what the name of, you know, the Maroons, but she doesn't know. She's like, why would I know that? You know, I grow up, because people grow up in a certain culture, so their knowledge is the same as everybody else in that particular culture, unless there have been avenues out with that. And so I think sometimes the microaggressions that come with it is that there is an expectation that you're able to speak from a position that actually you have no idea. You know, you don't come from the position that is placed on you. So I wanted to explore that in different ways. And also, you know, people don't feel different until they reach a certain age, and then the difference is placed on them. And I also wanted to look at that as well, because you just think you're part and parcel of everything, but then suddenly you're faced with the realization that not everybody else sees you like that. But I think, you know, from my own sort of personal experience, and one of the things that I wanted sort of Jeddah towards the end is about sort of accepting who you are, is that the way you see yourself is never going to exist in the minds of anyone else, because everyone else will, you'll all be looking at me and having your own particular opinion of me. So in Kenya, when I go to the village, they'll run and say mzungu, 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 which is white person. I don't see myself as a white person. When I came to Scotland, everyone gave me the identity of being African. I didn't know I was African. So people are always going to see you. And I thought that, there was a point when I used to get really quite annoyed. And then I thought, actually, if I'm annoyed every time somebody sees me as something different to how I see myself, I'm just going to be annoyed all the time. So it doesn't matter. I know who I am. And if people see something different, then that's their business. I've got bigger fish to fry. So yeah, I kind of wanted to sort of put that onto Jeddah as well a little bit. Yeah, to find herself and find her roots. Yeah.
And there are some lovely vignettes all the way through. I love the moment where, Jeddah is remembering how her mum, she always brought a drink for somebody and always made the food go round. Meanwhile, her dad's thinking, well, we could just stop having food when the visitors turn up unexpectedly rather than having to share it round. And I just thought, you're portraying this child who sees a whole set of expectations going on from the adults around her, that she's never really thought about, and it's in the stories that she kind of really begins to see those differences, which is really interesting. And you have a very strong auntie figure in here, so as the aunt who might be the mother's sister or simply a very, very good friend, I think. And I was struck by the way that she guides, and there seems to be since this is a religion and literature festival, there seems to be a number of things that meet. So you have the auntie figure who goes to church, and yet is also very alert to the spiritual journey, really, that Jeddah is on, she's being possessed by these stories, taken out of herself, having sort of an ecstatic experience in the kind of literal sense of the word. Can you say a little bit more about Auntie, but also about this kind of these intertwinings of different spiritual expectations?
Yeah, I like the question actually, because I think it sort of draws. Well, I drew so much from kind of little personal experiences on through my life. So, for example, I have an older sister who has learning difficulties, quite mild. You wouldn't even notice until you'd spent a little bit of time with her. And my mother is, she grew up in the orphanage. She was educated. She's a very intelligent, smart woman. But there was a point when we went to Kenya when my sister was older, about maybe 17 or 18, and we went to the traditional healer, who had cat bones and all the things that you might associate with the traditional healer, in an attempt to try and fix the learning difficulties of my older sister. And I remember just sort of watching that, from my own perspective, thinking, goodness, even though, because my mother is very Catholic, very, very, we argue, in fact, we don't even talk about religion anymore because we have very different perceptions of it. But she's very, very Catholic, yet at the same time, there was this thing that kind of really attracted her or drew her, or that she believed could make some difference. And I think that we see that all the time. I think with particularly my experience, I suppose, of the African churches in Edinburgh, is that there is this, there's two things going on at the same time. You can be very religious, yet at the same time there is an underlying belief in something else. And so I think my whole life has been peppered with those kinds of experiences. But for me, Auntie in the book, and her support of Jeddah, is that she also understands that everybody has got their own way to absorb information and to become themselves in a way. And even though Auntie is very religious in her sense, she also has experienced these kinds of stories of her own and sort of navigated her own journey. So she knows that actually Jeddah needs to go through this. And so when she's coming out of one of the stories, it's almost like she's in a trance, in a kind of hypnotic state. And Auntie is there and she says, actually, she's not having a fit. She's not crazy. It's just this is something that needs to happen. And so there is an acceptance of that and a facilitation of that where the stories just need to happen.
Yeah, it's a lovely moment. I like that. And then, of course, the father, who is working on is worried, should this child have a psychologist and that kind of thing. But one of the nice things in the story is that Jeddah recognizes that the shadow man that she overcomes in quite a violent, personally violent way, but he's also haunting her father. And I just wondered, this character who is deceitful, who drags down self-confidence, that kind of eats away at the soul. I was kind of, if you don't mind me thinking, I was thinking Dementors in a different genre of books, but that kind of eats in the self-doubt, the depression. And just perhaps say a little bit about that character.
Yeah, I think I love the character of the Shadow Man because every one of us has this character in us, and the Shadow Man is everywhere and speaks to us in different ways. So in when I was doing the story earlier, and that whole thing about I tell you all the time, this beast, it could be the media that is representing this is what somebody looks like. It's the othering of somebody, and the Shadow Man, it's it's so it comes to us in different ways. So it's that there's a point at the beginning, or kind of close to the beginning of the book, where she's up Arthur's seat and the Shadow Man enters her, so like physically enters her. And I guess with that moment, I was also thinking about how easy it's easy for us to absorb fear, because fear can be quite comforting at times. It's easier to just remain in this particular state rather than, put fear to the side and just kind of launch ourselves out on this very dangerous journey. So there is a loveliness about having fear close to us. And a lot of us, I have kept fear close to me and for a lot of my life, trying to sort of challenge that now. But, everybody has these moments where we keep fear. And it's when you actually realize that, wait a minute, having this fear in me is really unhelpful, because it's fear of yourself and who you are and what gifts you have to offer the world. And it's that voice: you're not good enough, you're not strong enough, you're not brave enough, you're not smart enough. The whole imposter syndrome that people talk about, that's the Shadow Man speaking to us all the time. But equally, in the second story, the Shadow Man also tells us about other people, because this fear is, we have to be careful of people like, with this kind of hair, or we have to be wary of people who wear glasses, or we have to be wary of, so-and-so, because of all kinds of ridiculous reasons. And so that voice speaks to us in so many different ways. And I think the Shadow Man is, because he comes out in different ways. I think at the beginning, I sort of, when the mother is telling her daughter the stories and she introduces the Shadow Man, she describes him in different ways. He's a cloud of dust, or a beautiful angel, or a glittering creature in some way. So, he is presented in so many different ways, because, these voices do speak to us in lots of different ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm now going to turn to our audience and see if there are any questions from the audience. And depending on how many questions there are, we may still be able to hear the end of that final story. Please. Now, I think there is a mic, because we are recording this, and it would be nice to get the questions on the mic. So, Kathy, person in the middle there.
I can't wait to...
Yes, you may take your mask off to ask a question.
I can't wait to read your book after this. This has just been great. As part of your answer to the first question, you mentioned that you of course, never know how your stories are going to land with different audiences and different audience members. And so you said you have to be flexible. And I'm just curious, how much do you change your stories or alter your stories or the performance of your stories based on your expectation of the audience and the way they might accept it? And what factors do you look at?
Quite a lot, actually. Sometimes I will have my program of stories, or the kinds of stories that I plan to tell, and I walk in and that story is not right for this audience. And I don't know, it's an instinct. I don't really know how to explain it. You gauge the mood of the audience, and if it is a story that you are going to tell, or the way you tell it, you get a sense of just how people are feeling. If there is if the energy is quite low, then you introduce the story in a certain way and then maybe kind of pick the audience up a little bit. And then sometimes you get an audience who you just sort of feel are ready to engage, and therefore you kind of bring them in a lot more. Because we were talking about timings of stories, and sometimes it can be difficult to know, because depending on what the audience gives you, a story can be 8 minutes long or 15 minutes long. It completely depends. So and with storytelling, the performance is, the audience is at the heart of everything. So you will absolutely modify your story to accommodate the audience, whereas with literature it's fixed. So that was my nervousness about I can't change the story. People, I can't change it, I can't fix it, that's it, set in stone. But with performance, then you have got the ability to just sort of draw on people and ask them and involve them in the story. And, sometimes the audiences who are not familiar with storytelling, there's this fear of like, oh no, she's going to pick me, please don't pick me. But there is, you don't have to respond, you don't have to engage. You say, don't pick me, pick somebody else. That is part of the storytelling experience, and then fine, I have to respect your input and then move to somebody else. But it adds to the, that sharing. It's a relationship essentially between the audience and the storyteller. So the audience has to be at the heart of everything.
Thank you. Agana.
Thank you very much, Mara. That was amazing. I found myself reflecting on some of the more religious themes in the first performance. I like how there seems to be this two-way dependency between the hunter and the Orishas. So the Orisha wants the hunter's help to present a gift. But in fulfilling that request, the hunter has to continuously pray. And while you told the story, I wondered which of the Orishas, perhaps the same one who's asked him for this bird, is that the one he's praying to? So I like that element of the spiritual as an enigmatic relationship between the human and the divine, which you can't always locate specifically. I find that when we get up into the heavenly realm, right, and we are before Oludumare knows that it's his mother who's about to die. He does not supply the information. And I just wondered whether there's a deliberateness in that omission, so that perhaps he can learn the lesson. But also on just on a lighter note, as a bird watcher myself, I wondered perhaps which bird might have inspired that bird he was looking for. But thank you, it was a brilliant performance.
Okay, thank you. I think for me, we're all responsible for the decisions that we make, and we can't be told what to do, or we should never be told what to do, because otherwise there's no learning for us and there's no growth in who we are as people. So if the information had been given, then he would have made a different decision, or he would have made no decision, or he would have been confused as to what decision he made. So, I think for all of us, I think for me certainly, there is value in not knowing, and there is value in making wrong decisions, as long as we learn from them. And sometimes the greatest lessons that we learned are from the most brutal, painful experiences that we can possibly have. And it's about accepting all of that as well, because if you are hurt by something and you don't accept it, then you're never going to heal. So it's all part of a journey that we're on as people. And so for Olodumare, it's an essential part of Ochosi's growth and learning. In terms of the bird, I don't know which bird. I think first of all, I love the bird sound. I practice, and I really like it if a bird responds. I feel like I can communicate with the birds. I tell my children that, this is what it's saying, and I lie to them. But yeah, I love nature and I love forests, and I spend a lot of time in that space. So maybe I'm inspired by everything.
I think perhaps now it's time for the final story. It's been lovely to both be able to talk about the stories that are now text in this book, but that have come out of your performance as a storyteller. So it seems very fitting if you can get yourself back into the middle of that story. to round off this session by performing the end of it. Thank you.
So I shall go from... The shadow man has slithered over the table into his drink and has cast his spell. And then the shadow man, he began to take words and he began to mold and form them into weapons, and he handed them to the young man with the furrowed brow. And the young man took these weapons, and he aimed them at the beast. And the young man with the sparkling eyes, he felt these weapons, these words pierce his skin, and he whipped around to face his enemy, and there it was. A loathsome creature, saliva dripping to the ground, claws shining, glittering in the moonlight. He saw the creature approach him, hunched over, hungry for blood. And it wasn't long before the two beasts launched themselves at each other. They were punching, they were ripping, they were tearing, they were gouging, they were flinging each other to the ground. Roar after roar, raging, riding that wave of rage, until suddenly there was a glint, and the young man with the sparkling eyes, he fell backwards to the ground, clutching his stomach. As he lay there on the cobblestones, he looked up to the skies, and he heard the moon and the stars calling him home. His eyes closed, his hands fell to his side, and his chest stilled. And slowly his body began to fragment into 1,000 tiny little shards of light, and they floated upwards, sparkling and twinkling towards the moon. And far away, in a distant land, there was a husband and his wife, and they were sitting around a fire when suddenly they looked up and they noticed a beautiful, beautiful star. It reminded them of their son. It reminded them of the starlight pouring out of his eyes, and they began to imagine all the adventures that he would be having high up in the land in the sky. And that's the story inspired by Ahmed Sheikh from the Grass Market. Thank you.
Thank you very much for showing us how stories bring joy, bring us into painful places, make us understand and speak differently to each other. It has been a lovely, lovely time to talk with you. And can I just remind you again, the book is in the Rainy Hall, which is just out that way on your way out. And if you're looking for a Christmas present, this is it. Okay. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us, and do take some time to look at the bookstore. Thank you.
Thank you.